Hi, and welcome to the Restorative Wellness Clinicians Corner, a video series exclusively for functional health professionals, where we interview the top experts in the latest research, products, tools, and best practices for getting your clients exceptional results. Welcome, everyone. I am super excited for today's episode of the RWS Clinicians Corner. We are in for such a treat. So before I read her formal bio, I just want to tell you a personal story. So Dr. Jordan Robertson, who are you going to hear from tonight, and I met in person, oh gosh, when was it? Was it in June, I think, of this year? And both of us had multiple people reaching out and say, oh my gosh, I know I had many people say, oh my gosh, at this next event, you got to find Dr. Jordan Robertson. You two are going to absolutely love each other. And we met and they were absolutely right. Dr. Jordan is just doing such incredible work. And I'm super excited to get into what I think is going to be a really nuanced, maybe challenging, but challenging in a really good way, conversation about the importance of clinical research in our field of functional health. So if you haven't met Dr. Jordan Robertson before, you have been missing out on the opportunity to have a friend, an ally, and a mentor in your work life. Her list of accomplishments is really just a reflection of her relentless pursuit of better patient care, better practitioner support, and more collaborative care in medicine in general. She is the founder of Clarity Health, which is a massive naturopathic clinic in Ontario that has served over 20,000, I'm not exaggerating, 20,000 patients. She's a podcast host with ambitions of making accurate women's health information accessible to all. She's the offsite ND for the endometriosis clinic at McMaster Hospital and instructor for the undergraduate health sciences program, as well as the founder of the Confident Clinician. So the Confident Clinician, and that's really the auspices under which she is here chatting with us today. It's a practice resource and database for naturopathic doctors and functional health practitioners of all types to help elevate their professional practice by offering clinical practice guidelines, patient resources, and ongoing training. She is changing the way naturopathic doctors and functional health professionals all over the world practice and integrate in medicine, with the Confident Clinician currently supporting over 600 NDs in North America and worldwide. She could see all of the problems in her industry that were holding practitioners back, and she built the program to solve them. So, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. That makes me sound busy.
It does make you sound busy. Well, you are busy, but all to say, very competitive athlete. And so divides her time with young children, multiple businesses, and very serious athletic endeavors. So I feel like in many ways, a sister from another mister, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to start off with your story. What brought you to this place where not only are you working with your patients and clients, but you are supporting other clinicians in such a profound way?
Yeah, so my story starts like in my undergraduate career, actually. And so I had this sort of good fortune of both myself and my husband randomly got into the same undergraduate program. And yes, we have been together since we were in grade 11. And so we both went to this unique program, which makes sense in the story later on. But the program is really designed to help support critical thinkers. So McMaster University in Hamilton is well known for their unique approach to teaching medicine, where first-year students are thrown into tutorial with patients from day one. And they built an undergraduate program that is modeled after that MD program, where we had patient simulations, we had very hard conversations, we had to learn critical thinking, we had to learn communication skills, conflict resolution, group process, all the things that actually just build great learners. And then from that, we could go and do whatever we wanted. And my husband chose to be a dentist, and I decided that I was going to pursue some area of medicine. And I had a difficult time picking which field I wanted to go in. It's interesting, the some of the medical professions that we get drawn to when we're in that undergraduate space are actually some of the least creative career options out there, right? People are like, what advice would you give your children, going into their future careers? I'm like, don't do medicine. I'm like, it's boring. And it's boring in the sense that when you work in that conventional system, the answers are already there for you. The boundaries that you work in, the lanes that you live in or fly in are quite narrow. And so we have all these brilliant minds, that are orthopedic surgeons and cardiologists who really are working in these very narrow lanes. It's not very creative work. And so I actually was more drawn to preventative medicine, nutrition. I really loved exercise and how behavior medicine was influencing people's ability to stay well. So I love thinking about how patients make decisions about their healthcare journey, about how compliance really changes people's outcomes. And so I ended up going to the Naturopathic College. And while I was there, I went from this problem-based learning format where, I knew my instructors and dean on a first name basis. I had lots of flexibility in my curriculum. I could think critically. We didn't have a lot of exams. It was really about growing ourselves as learners. And then I went to the Naturopathic College where I wrote 2,000 multiple choice tests. I, sat in a room and we listened to someone speak at us for 4 years. And we were basically trained to write tests and not think that critically. There was very little of the work that was ever referenced in the Naturopathic College. And there wasn't a lot of thinking about how should be critical about the work that we're doing. So if someone feels better when they eat gluten-free, are we really asking ourselves why that happens? Or are we, subscribing to just our traditional beliefs around why that's happened? So when I left the Naturopathic College, I was like, oh, that's like my last multiple choice test. I started practicing on my own and had a great and very successful practice. I had great collaborative relationships with medical doctors, with the hospitals. And then it was only maybe a few years in that I realized that my colleagues did not feel the same way about how they worked with patients. They felt lost creating treatment plans. They felt like we didn't have the resources that other professions had, where the medical doctors had standards of care, that we were left with trying to scour our notes from our past instructors to figure out what to do with patients. And we didn't really have the tools to stay up to date. So if new research came out, my colleagues didn't have the skills to actually read it. So this is where I realized that we had this sort of big problem in our industry, that we weren't all playing from the same playbook. If you saw one naturopath, they might tell you one thing, and you saw another ND, they might tell you something completely different. And I actually was not that okay with that we had all these random suggestions that we'd give patients just based on what, the latest supplement company had said, or based on what you'd learned at the last seminar. So we built the Confident Clinician, which is what we're, talking about today, is really that critical thinking piece around medicine to help give clinicians this sort of framework that they can start to think about what they do with patients, but also provide them with the evidence for why we should be doing what we're doing. So that's how I got all the way up to this point. Was mostly from that undergraduate experience where I was really pushed to be flexible in my thinking. And that truly has sort of given me this springboard to work off of in my career.
I think that's a beautiful story. And it's actually this almost flipped narrative, right? Because we in the functional space often think that our peers in the conventional medical world are so fixed and, only thinking within the standard of care and never thinking outside. And the fact that you had this incredible experience more within that mainstream medical model, but really looking at the critical thinking and being able to unpack the research, unpack and problem solve. I mean, this is something that we spend so much time discussing as an instructor team. We discuss it with all of our students and alumni. I mean, that critical thinking piece is one of the most essential ingredients to being a really really effective clinicians. And I would love you to tell us, what is the evolution that you're seeing in functional medicine for now? Like, how are people receiving this? Because as we were sharing, in my earliest training, it was, somebody sitting by a fireplace chatting about sort of clinical pearls. It was sitting in a seminar with people who had been doing this work for years, passing down ideas of herbs and diets. And it was just a lot of clinical trial and error. So how are you seeing the reception to more of an evidence-based approach now?
Well, it can definitely be uncomfortable, right? Because, and I will sign it, always use sort of the same examples, but I'd love to think that if a study came out saying that fish oil was killing everybody, that we'd stop using it. Right. I'd love to think that. And yet, in the functional space, it would take us a very long time to change our mind about that. And yet, if we would really want our conventional friends to immediately cease prescribing something that showed harm or showed no benefit, right? If we had a study that came out that said, this drug is no longer working, we would chastise a medical doctor who used it after that point. And yet we can be quite slow to adopt change or adopt a change in our thinking. Maybe the reason people feel better when they eat gluten-free isn't because of what we thought.
Right.
They still feel better, but maybe it's not for the reasons we thought. Can we, right, as a group, change our thinking? Because we would absolutely demand that our medical doctors would do the same. So I think part of it for me is just holding ourselves accountable to some of the things we ask for in medicine in general. And quite often in the functional space, we have the luxury of working with quite well people. And so the stakes are not that high, right? If you have a very well 37-year-old woman who comes to see you who wants slightly more glowing skin, well, we don't actually have to succeed because she'll be just fine if we don't. But as the stakes increase and as the severity of the conditions we work with starts to increase, the demand for outcomes actually goes up. And we need to sort of hold ourselves to that same standard that we would expect from our peers in conventional care. And I actually think it's more fun, right? Like personally, I think it's more fun for us to imagine that we could change our mind about something or evolve as medicine evolves. But it can be quite scary, especially if we identify as, some of the things that we practice, right? And I actually have an article coming out in one of our magazines saying we're married to the methods, right? And we really shouldn't be. We shouldn't necessarily be married to our strategies, married to the answer. We should be married to an outcome. We want our patients to be more well. And if we learn something new that was going to make them even more well than what we've used in the past, can we as an industry actually change our mind? Can we change our tactics, our strategies to adopt new things? Can we let go of some of those old things, which I think is maybe the harder of the two? You usually tend to be on that sort of biohacking. When new things come out, we're very quick to adopt them. We're very slow to put things down as an industry and say, I'm no longer going to do that.
I want to unpack an example here because we've had an example of this within our curriculum recently, and there's been a lot of pushback. There's been a lot of questions, and I've noticed my own just deep resistance. And this is around vitamin D dosing and vitamin D ranges. So as we know, as our alumni know who've gone through our blood chemistry class, we used to go with these really, really aggressive ranges. Now I'm realizing your units of measure are different than our units of measure, but I'm sure you can do the conversion because you're in these numbers day in, day out. But, we would want people between like 70 to 90, right? Like these really aggressive numbers. And then more and more, we kept coming across research that showed no significant benefit when it was that high and some risks of, calcification and some like really serious risks. And I can still remember when, the individual who is responsible on our team, she's an incredible practitioner. She's always staying up on the research. When she brought this to us as a team and said, like, we've really got to look at this and change our ranges, and the conversations we had and the debates that we had, and then looking at the research and was like, no, this is what makes sense. If we think, well, we're, we definitely have some medical practitioners here, but a lot are, nutrition professionals. So but we still want to sort of do no harm, right? Like that first do no harm. And so if there is not a clear upside and there is evidence of a possible downside, it feels like our absolute responsibility to go with a more conservative range. And there's still a lot of people in the functional space who push for those really, really high ranges. So it's an uncomfortable place to be. So we have experienced this really firsthand. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because I think that, is this just part of human nature? Is this part of insecurity, maybe as functional practitioners, because we're always sort of stepping outside the conventional medical model? So, maybe there's a little bit of an inferiority complex and wanting to, like, if we've been saying this, like, oh my gosh, what does it say about us if we were wrong, right? And we need to change. And as you say, though, we want to be forward thinking. We want to be pioneering, and being pioneering by definition means changing our minds when new data comes out. So I would love you to help us unpack this, because it's an example I think everybody on this call can resonate with.
Yeah, and we've had similar examples of that in our community as well. I'm a fierce believer, believer actually makes it sound like it's a belief. I am a fierce advocate for us letting go of the term estrogen dominance. And in the world of naturopathic medicine, that would get you burned at the stake, instantly. And it's been a long slog for our community to shift their languaging around that particular term and come to, I'm going to say, correct ourselves over time with the way that we message around hormone levels on lab work. So we have this very specific example that I think we've had the same sort of evolution around. And it's interesting because I think, 100 years ago, we knew lots of things about functional medicine, but didn't have the evidence for it. Right. And now we actually have a lot of evidence for what we do. And so that is amazing, but it's meant that there are some things that we did 100 years ago that we were wrong about, or that we were maybe not as accurate as we could be. And so, but changing our mind to that really sort of amplifies some of the way that we think about ourselves, the way we think about our relationship with medicine, the way that we present ourselves online, right? It's actually risky for many clinicians to change their mind. I have to remind myself of that daily when I go to speak to new groups. I'm like, Jordan, not everyone has the privilege of being able to change their mind because they've built a business around the opposite, right? They've built a business around the thing you're asking them to rethink. And that's very difficult, right? But I also think it's very brave, and it actually can build stronger relationships with conventional medicine. And I do think that the path forward for many functional medicine practitioners actually is to have allies on the conventional side, because they can't do what we do. They don't have the time, the resources, or the training. So imagine if we spoke their language. Imagine if we showed up beside them and said, yeah, we value the science too. I actually think that's the biggest business building thing we could possibly do as functional medicine practitioners. But to come back to why it's so hard, I mean, there's so many biases and cognitive distortions that we have in ourselves. And that critical thinking piece is really about trying to unpack them, right? And so, it'd kind of be like if you're like a Swiftie and you saw Taylor Swift wear a really ugly turtleneck, like we actually probably would put up with it because we love her, right? We'd be like, you know what? Do I want one of those turtlenecks too? And it's so easy for us to actually get pulled in and connected to ideas based on how they're presented, right? Is it someone you love that you worked with that taught you everything you know? Yeah. Is it something that you heard on your first day of school and you're like, this is why I'm here. This makes sense to me. Or is it the thing you learned at the last seminar and now all of a sudden everyone you see seems to have Lyme disease, and thank God you took that conference last weekend? Right. These are all examples of cognitive distortions. Is it the thing you heard first? Is it the thing you heard last? Is it the thing you saw on Instagram? Is it the thing that you saw Gwyneth Paltrow say? These are all cognitive distortions, and they're very, big examples, or maybe like exaggerated examples. But we see examples of this in medicine all the time. And that's actually why we've moved away in conventional medicine from this sense of oral tradition, because you would have your instructor who was 180 tell you what they did in medicine, and we would hold it in a regard that was so high that even if residents watched their patients die following that dude's advice, they found it very difficult to change their tactics because the elder told them what to do. And so we had to come up with a better strategy. And I actually think it's quite beneficial for young practitioners and young people in the field, and by young, I mean either in age or in your time in the industry, is that the way we used to teach medicine is that we valued you if you were here for a long time. Right. And if you were just graduated, we actually didn't value you. And I totally don't believe that. I think that your ideas, that your innovation, that your work with patients is just as or more valuable than the people that are on their way out. And like, how refreshing is that if we thought that the people who graduated today were better than the people who graduated yesterday? And that's how we train our clinicians, is like, you guys be better than me. Like, go be better than me. And that's actually, when we think about what evidence-based care looks like, that's what that means. It means we're training clinicians to be better than the generation that came before them, not striving to be as good as the generation that came before them. And it's actually quite like empowering, actually, if we can think about it that way, but it's uncomfortable to change our mind.
I love all of this so much. Where to even start? So how do we identify that cognitive bias and unpack it? Because it is, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can think of moments with the vitamin D when like certain practitioners that I was following when I was still in school, and I just, everything they said, I took as like the word, right? And they're still on a higher vitamin D dose, right? And I'm thinking, I will second guess things, right? Even though the data points otherwise. So how do we be on alert for that, recognize it, and fight it?
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for bringing it back to the vitamin D. I got totally lost in my Taylor Swift example and forgot what the original question was.
No worries. No worries. We've got lots of time. There's so many good questions.
We circled back.
Yeah.
So a couple of things, like one, when we need to be able to examine like every step of our decision making and ask ourselves if it still holds true. Right. And so when we think about this vitamin D example, let's say a new paper comes out that suggests that there's no benefit above a certain reference range. And you've got a person sitting across from you at the table, and you've got research in front of you. You've got your old work, right, that says vitamin D dosing should be high. And now we also have a patient sitting across from us. Good critical appraisal allows you to try and reconcile where each of those things has, shown itself to be true, even though maybe it actually isn't true. So your patient might be different than, the patients in the past. Right. So maybe like the patients that we looked at in the past, or your instructors that talked about this in the past, maybe the knowledge on vitamin D was so low that everybody was that deficient. Maybe it did make sense for us to dose everybody that high. Maybe it was worth the risk at that time, or maybe we didn't understand the risks at that time. And then when we fast forward to research that's been done now, we have to ask ourselves, is our patient more like that person? Right? Like this person who's just been studied. We have a study on 10,000 perimenopausal women, and it says they don't need extra vitamin D. And the person sitting across from you is a perimenopausal woman. That's how you start to like reconcile some of those pieces, is that we want to use research to help us understand our patients. And studies are also giving us odds, right? It's like gambling.
Right.
And so if the study says that you don't need to go above a certain dose in vitamin D and you choose to anyways, you're kind of like betting on the bad horse, essentially. Right. And if I said like, here's $20, tell me which horse you want to bet on. This one wins. And this one, it's a little risky. They might have a calcification if you bet on this horse, right? Figuratively, where do you want to put your money? Because that's essentially what we're doing with our patients' money and their health and lives, is saying, where do you want to place your bets? And so when we start to see research that's pointing in the direction of like different care, or we need to change our mind, what we've learned is that the odds actually are stacked over here, and they're not stacked over here any longer. So where do you want to put your money? Right. And so, but it is hard. And I agree with you, Margaret, that like, as we start to like have to untrain some of those pieces, it does bring up a lot for thinking about those questions. But I think some simple things you can do is ask yourself, like, where did I learn this? Right? Like, where did this idea come from for me? And are all the things all the circumstances that I learned it in still hold true? Or have we learned something new that's going to like push me to change my mind about it? Um, I think that can start to help us unpack like why it's so difficult to change our mind about something.
Totally. So I want to circle back even further to a comment that you made about the gluten, right? So we know the vast majority, I mean, I can personally say in my practice, having seen thousands and thousands of clients, I have had one person not feel better taking gluten out of their diet, right? And there were some extenuating things and everything was kind of flipped, but it didn't resolve everything for sure. But most, like the vast majority, felt significantly better. Now, was it the only thing? No, like there's always a bazillion different confounding pieces, right? Like I've never have just, I did not for, 1,000 people only remove gluten. And that was the only variable. There's always other things going on, but there's always been a piece of things. And you mentioned, we know people feel better going off of gluten, but maybe the mechanisms are different than what we thought. How important do you think that is, the mechanism piece? If we know that when you come back to the comment of, are we married to the methods or are we married to the outcomes? If we know when I do this, I see that the vast majority of the time, how much does it matter? Why?
I love that question. It's a good one, right? And I think, when we think about nutrition's really hard to research, right? Like it's hard and it is a different skill than studying anything biomedical. And so I always think like you guys have it easy over there in the pharmaceutical industry. You know which dose to give, you know how long to give it for, you know what to expect on the outcome.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have nutrition research and we're like, wait a minute, when they took out gluten, did they take out gluten or did they actually eat more vegetables?
Right.
Did they take out gluten or did they change the amount of protein that they ate as a ratio in their, in their nutrition? Did they take out gluten or did they actually come back to their cultural diet and they've migrated to North America and actually they should eat a little bit more like their Southeast Asian diet for their best health outcomes and now they're doing that? Did they take out gluten or, right? Like these are the questions we have to ask ourselves when it comes to nutrition research, because there's the replacement effect, there's the interview effect. Did they take out gluten or did they just feel like you cared? Because that actually influences people's outcomes big time when it comes to medicine. And we just don't have that in conventional care. And so I think the reason why people get better is important. Do we need to always understand it? No, but we need to acknowledge that we don't understand it. And we need to acknowledge that it's actually multifactorial why people get better. So where I struggle with, functional medicine online is when someone says, well, you got better because your immune system is now calmer because you took out gluten. And they build their entire image around how the immune system is being shifted because someone took out gluten. And I'm like, no, they just stopped going to McDonald's. Right? Like that was it. It wasn't the gluten at all. It was the McMuffin, right? Or it was like every time they had gluten, they had like 6 cups of coffee. And if we got rid of the gluten, we also got rid of the 6 cups of coffee. And so I don't think we have to know the mechanism why. I think we have to be transparent that nutrition is complex. Because if we pretend to know the answer, that's where we get into trouble. Because mechanistically, sure, if we put, gluten in a petri dish, it causes all sorts of problems, but so does Coke and so does dirt, right? Like, I don't think we are going to change the way we practice based on what dirt does in a petri dish either. And so I think when we represent ourselves as understanding the mechanism, that's where we get into trouble. But if we can acknowledge that nutrition is complicated, that the way people heal is really complicated. And you might get better just because we chatted, actually, or because you're paying for something and you're taking care of yourself for the first time in a million years. Those all have a profound impact on how our patients do. But if we pretend it's because, their T cells did something special because we took gluten out, I think we're missing the point. And that's where we get in trouble online, is being called, not evidence-based, because technically that really isn't.
That's such an important piece. And I think, we all kind of fall into our own camps when it comes to dietary paradigms. And I think everything that you're saying here is, for, maybe those of us on this call who, love gluten-free diets, it can be a little hard to hear about that. But if we're all those of us on this call who are not into plant-based diets can definitely point our fingers, when it's like one of the big documentaries comes out and we're like, but wait a second, is it because they removed animals or is it because now they're eating vegetables, not chugging back Coke, like not, all of these other factors. So I think what's so important to remember is that we fall into those same cognitive, back to your point about cognitive bias, we fall into that just as much as somebody in the field who might have a different perspective on what is the moving factor. I feel like, we joke as a team, and we've definitely had feedback on this from our students, is that it gets annoying when people ask a question and we say, well, it depends. We joke that, even one of our students once said she almost had a drinking game. Like every time we say it depends, it's like, going for, it's like, oh, there they go again. Right. But it's true. It all depends. It's so multifactorial. And we're never, just as you said, with nutrition, but even with nutrients, when we're intervening with lifestyle, with diet, with supplementation, it's really hard to point the finger and say, that's what did it. And that's what all of us want to be able to do. Is it the methodology as a whole? Is it this one thing? Is it this other thing? We play around with it. And of course, this actually brings me to a question I really want to ask about, which is this idea of standard of care. Because I think that the idea of standard of care is a tricky one for a lot of people in the functional space, because we all think we do it the best way, right? And so it's like, well, standard of care is great if it's my way. But standard of care, how good is that if it's somebody else's way? Or if it says, then we get into like guru wars, right? Like who has figured it out? And so I would love to unpack this idea of because I think moving to standards of care, and I will admit I'm as uncomfortable with that as anyone else. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I'm sitting outside being all judgy. Like, I am like the first in all of this to like get my like, oh gosh, no. I get it. I see it in myself all the time, we teach a program with a very specific methodology, right? And we see great results with it. And so it's like, well, this is what works. But I also know that other people teach great methodologies and those work too. So how do we as an industry move to a place where there are standards, like formal standards of care, while still balancing this ability to pioneer, to experiment, to try new things in the context of a world where, and you can completely correct me if I'm wrong, but absolutely the perception is where the money is going to invest in research is heavily based in conventional medicine, pharma-based. And this sort of, there's definitely more research coming out than there ever has been in terms of functional tools, let's call them. But how do we get to a place where we have those standards of care? And is it possible to get there while maintaining that creativity?
I think that's a really great question. And I do believe that we can get there. I think part of what makes clinicians unique is the strategy, right? It's the how, it's the when, it's the in what order, it's the how am I going to say it? How am I going to hold you accountable? How are we going to tweak this to fit your life? I think where we struggle as an industry is that someone could see someone over here and get one answer, and someone can see someone over here and get another answer. If this person's right, why isn't this person doing it?
Right.
Right. And like, how fair is that to the patient that it's a roll of the dice or who has more followers on Instagram where they land, and they may not actually receive the treatment that has been shown to be the best treatment for them? We would never tolerate that conventionally, right? They'd be like, well, how good looking is that oncologist, right? Like, that's how I'm going to make that decision. I'm going to go see that guy and hopefully he picks the right treatment, right? We just wouldn't tolerate it. You'd really expect that if you went to one medical center or another, that you were getting the best of the best. And so I agree that we need more research in our field. I disagree that we don't have enough legs to stand on. And I know that's not what you said, but that's a common narrative that like, well, we don't have any research, so we don't need to use it. Right. I don't think that's true. There's thousands and thousands. There's actually so much research that clinicians can't keep up to the research on integrative care as an individual, which is why we built the Confident Clinician. But there's so much literature about what we should be doing that we have to at least start there. And I totally recognize, like, I'm knee deep in PubMed every day. I know that there's industry funding on both sides. There's lots of turmeric companies funding turmeric studies.
You bet.
There's a lack of trial participants in some groups, it's so hard to recruit people that are pregnant to do anything in research. So we have underrepresented people. I totally get that there's a gender bias in literature. Does all of those things mean we shouldn't use the vitamin D research? Right? Like, no, like we should at least start there. And I think where creativity comes in, or that, that feeling of biohacking or whatnot, is going to come when, if we have 10 things that we know without a shadow of a doubt improve outcomes, please don't start with number 11 that's never been studied. Right? Like, and the person you might meet, and this is where we have to do some self-reflection on this. Many of us work with a self-selected population who has said no to conventional care, who has said no to option 1 through 10, or who has failed all of those options. And I totally recognize that sometimes the person sitting across from you has tried everything. And that's maybe where we get to be creative and say, you know what, I'm going to borrow this mouse study over here and we're going to try it anyways. Or I've seen this one other time in my career. Are you with me if we try something creative? Right. The problem is when we start there. Right. And Janet has no idea that you're going based off of one other case you saw, when there's 10,000 participants in trials that show what we maybe should do with her. I think that's where I would like us to get to as an industry, where we acknowledge the amount of research we do have, we start there, or at the very least, we're transparent that we're not there. Right. And if your patient says, I have this really strong value of eating plant-based, even if it's not the best thing for me, you go, sounds great. As long as we're both on the same page that we're not doing the most evidence-based thing for you right now, that's okay. You can make a value-based decision. But often in functional medicine, the clinician is making a value-based decision for the patient. Yeah. And that's not okay. Right? That's not okay for you to say, this is the best, when it's the best according to you. And that's it. Why shouldn't we use the best according to everyone?
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think of, even something as simple, just as simple as like, which probiotics have the best results, right? Like the research funded by the supplement companies, research, think about the biases coming from that, seeing what's happening in your clinical practice. But again, you're never just using a probiotic. You're always doing a whole bunch of other things. So how do you, that's one of the things that we have, in terms of building RWS, I feel like we're a step in the right direction in that we're always doing before and after testing. So we're looking at symptom resolution. We're looking at how the client feels. We're looking at how markers are shifting, and the tests aren't perfect. There's all sorts of issues, even just with the testing, that we can unpack that as well. But there's certain products that we've tried and have just like, clients don't feel better. Nothing shifts on their labs. It's like, okay, we just toss that one, right? And then we use other ones, and not every time, but a lot of the time, oh, this product works really well in this kind of scenario, so how do we still, I guess I'm trying to envision a world in which we still have that sort of flexibility, and we have the research that we can lean on, especially when the claims they start to feel like marketing more than anything. And that is not unique to functional medicine. My good God, like look at conventional. We don't really watch much TV. And anytime I have, I've been like, oh my God, they still market these drugs so aggressively. So like, how do we navigate that?
I'm not sure I totally understand your question, so I can actually have you repeat it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, 100%. That was a lot of stuff there. So what I'm wondering is, how do we navigate making clinical decisions when so much of the research can feel either conflicting or have very biased just from this, like you said, turmeric companies fund a lot of turmeric research on their, is it better with black pepper? Is it better with this? What is the perfect combination? And every company has their data to show you why theirs is best. Not every company, the good ones will have their data, but then even between the good ones, how do we make those clinical decisions and try to navigate through the multiple layers of the cognitive bias we're already coming in with, plus the fact that a lot of this research starts to feel like just marketing driven.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, funding in research is funding in research. We're never going to get away from it because we need the turmeric company to
Right.
sponsor a turmeric study. Otherwise, we'd never have them, right?
Right.
It's more that we don't behave any better than the drug companies when it comes to funding that research. We're all doing the same thing, but we need it at the same time. And even when we think about those drug companies, like, thank goodness they pay for some of that research because we actually need them to.
Yeah. Oh,
And
100%.
so there's, from that perspective, I think as long as there's disclosure, as long as there's us recognizing that, like, as soon as a study is funded by the company that provided it, they do more often come. So when we've done studies on those studies, and they do turn out positive more often.
Yeah.
So if it's funded by the company that provided it, they get positive results more often. Why is that? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. It's probably an interviewer bias thing where, they're looking for particular things in the patients. And because they know it's their turmeric, they rate it better. But that part I can put down because I think that's just an industry wide, and I mean medicine as an
Yeah.
industry wide
100%.
challenge with funding, is that we have to accept funding from private. When people will say to me, like, well, Jordan, like, Big Egg sponsored that egg trial. And I'm like, well, who else was going to give us the eggs? Like, we just have to be okay with that. It's fine. Like,
Yeah.
I'll tolerate that research from Big Egg. Like, they donated like 1 million eggs to this study. So that part I'm okay with. I think where us as clinicians, we actually have the privilege of being a bit agnostic around which turmeric we use.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where when we make decisions as consumers, and even as clinicians, we are also consumers. We've done a little bit of this, testing in our community and even outside our community of like, well, why do we line our shelves with one particular supplement brand? Like, how did we make that decision? Do we like our rep? Do we like the label? When I was in school to become a naturopathic doctor, I worked at the largest natural food dispensary in Toronto. The reason people chose one vitamin C over another blew my mind. Right? It would be like, well, this one comes from hibiscus, and this one was not manufactured overseas, and this one has a really pretty label. Like, they were making decisions that had nothing to do with the ingredients. And we do that too, right? We're like,
We do.
we love people say, I love this company. Like, well, why? Why? If we're looking for 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, like, do we give a shit whose it is? Like, I don't know. I think these are important questions, because if we can sit agnostic, that actually puts us in a power position to just make a good decision or feel less pressure about our decisions. Whereas when we become connected to a particular probiotic or a particular turmeric, suddenly there is a bit more discomfort there because we're having to make a decision that's multi-layered. That has to do with the company's reputation and image and whatnot. When the research said give 1,000 milligrams of turmeric, as a clinician, are we making the decision about the brand, or are we just talking about the turmeric? And where we teach from, we're the only educational institute in Canada that has zero industry funding. So we're clinician owned and operated. We do not take sponsorship. We do, and for a reason, right? Like, how could I easily say, guys, it doesn't matter which vitamin C you're saying, but you guys should maybe use this one.
Yeah.
So we have that, and that's just our value. Look, I know that there's lots of reasons that we have to take industry funding, right? Because they do support the education of clinicians. But if for a moment we sat like in that agnostic position, it actually puts us in quite a power position to make a great decision. And it actually forces the companies to behave better too.
I completely agree. I mean, this is very much the decisions that we have made with RWS. Part of the reason why I adore you is that we will do the hard work ourselves and we will never just lean into one brand. And we've been very pressured to do that. We will never, ever just like endorse a line, endorse a lab, endorse anything. There's certain labs that we work with because we see the best clinical results in this particular combination of certain labs and the way that we use them. So, but that's not because we're getting anything from them. It's because this is where we've seen the best results. I mean, I have a very hard line, even around things like that have affiliate payments and such. Like, I will not, I have conversations with my CFO. She's like, oh, what do you predict for affiliate income? I'm like, 0. I don't ever want to make a decision of promoting something, whether it's clinical, business, anything, to make money from it. I want to make a recommendation based on if I absolutely love it and I think it's going to give value to either the clients of our practitioners or to the practitioners themselves. So that's been, and I know, and it's hard to do because there's a lot of money out there that I've had conversations with different labs. You're like, oh, can you, switch to this one, or switch to that one. And it's both it's a big conversation in terms of the rebuilding the materials, but it's not, there isn't money that would do it. I mean, I'm not trying to like make ourselves sound great, but I just think that being agnostic, I mean, we have what we call our healing solutions, which is, list of different supplements and protocols and recommendations that we have found work. And it's just across the board. It's all sorts of different companies. And that can get really frustrating for clinicians. They're like, well, which one? And then we come back to it depends, right? Which is that sort of frustrating answer.
Someone's going to get you a mug for Christmas that says it depends.
They really are. And that's great. That's great. I mean, even my clients are just, they like roll their eyes when I start to say that. But so I'm seeing I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure I save questions. I see some great questions in the chat. I want to ask you just before I open up the chat, and please guys bring your questions in. I mean, I think this is such an important and nuanced and critical conversation. I mean, I want to actually own something you and I were talking about before we even opened up the lines and started this call, is that, in the history of RWS, like we weren't good at citing the research. Right. And that's something that we have made a huge investment in, going back and making sure, going through all of our materials. And if there isn't research to back up mechanisms or to back up methodologies, we change the materials. And it's hard there's labor intensive, but it's not even that's hard. It's the saying, you know what, it's different than what we thought. But I think that's an insanely important process for us to go through for the credibility of the field overall. So my last question to you, and then I want to open it up to folks here to ask your questions, is what do you see if you were to just paint the picture, your vision of what is possible for the future of functional health? Like, where would you love to see this field go?
I'd love to see like functional clinicians or integrated medicine clinicians or naturopathic doctors sitting at the table, having a discussion about health with conventional care. I really believe we belong at that table based on, where our stumbling blocks are in the conventional model right now. I think we belong at that table, but we can only get invited into that table if we don't, wear opposition as our outfit, essentially. I think we've had this long history of being quite oppositional with conventional care, when we actually don't need to do that to be successful with our patients, be successful in our businesses, and have great health outcomes. I don't think there's as many people out there that want to banish the conventional options as sometimes we can have that feeling, right? That like, that's what people actually want from us. And I actually don't think there's that many of those people that are going to fire their family doctor to work with us. And I think we put patients in a really uncomfortable position when we position ourselves in that way, right? I don't want a she said kind of experience with myself and someone's family doctor. I'd like to understand my role deeply, understand my value, and just hang there, because there's actually so much that I can do and so much anyone in this field can do for patients without being this defiant child kind of interaction in medicine. And that's, I think, because we've had that image, that's probably why we're not getting invited to the table as often as I'd like us to. It's probably not why we're not speaking on big stages when it comes to medicine. And so if we really want to amplify our voice, we have to sit beside them and have the conversation. So that's what I would really like to see, because they're doing good work. Right. Yeah. They do great things. And the question in the chat, which I'd love to get to, like, yes, they save people all the time, right? Like, I don't want them to stop doing that. I'd like to support them while they do that, or support their patient when they leave the hospital, or so maybe they never have to go to the hospital in the first place. But I think they're doing wonderful things in conventional medicine.
I agree completely. And I think it's so important for us I love the collaborative spirit. I think that a lot of us get tainted if, if there is this sort of combative or, we have an idea of how things could go and, the medical, we make assumptions about the assumptions that a conventional medical practitioner is doing. And that's really dangerous in terms of its own form of bias. I can just give a simple example of, client's been on PPIs for years and years and years. And we can get really like hot and heavy about that, and it's like, well, why? Like, why do they do that? And maybe they didn't know any other alternatives. And are they willing to work with us on this? Is it that they're ignorant of the side effects? Unlikely. Is it that they're just, sort of big pharma's, for lack of a better word, bitch? Also, honestly, unlikely.
Unlikely.
Right? Like, not any more than we are. Right? Because, supplement reps come in and they're super savvy and they've got great presentations and they teach us great things. And that's awesome. But we have to, this is one of the things I just love about your approach is how it's just revealing that we need to play by the same standards that we're expecting of our conventional medical counterparts. And I think it's really important to honor that there's no, foundation out there that's trying to do harm. That's just, is there money? Yes, but it's money on all the sides. So for those who are watching the replay, the question in the chat is, this is a fascinating talk. Thank you, which I completely agree, Teresa. I'm curious about your thoughts on conventional versus alternative cancer care, which is specifically what she's asking about here. It's my perception that there are a lot of things being recommended in the alternative field that have little to no evidence to back them up, whereas the conventional care is often criticized as harmful and ineffective when it's one of the most highly researched and scrutinized in clinic.
True.
Yes.
The answer to that is you're right. We have lots of research that people who forego conventional care die faster. And we don't really, there is no leg to stand on for the alternative cancer treatments. And when we hear of the one, the crazy and wonderful, what we didn't hear was the thousands of people that died before they should have if they had just done chemo, right? And that's another form of that cognitive distortion, is that we get excited about that headline of the potential that one person overcame their cancer naturally. But what we're forgetting is that that's one person in a pool of many people who tried it. So the big question we should ask is well, what happened to everybody else? Right? If we've only got one guy on the front page of this magazine, why aren't there thousands of people on the front page of this magazine saying that they beat cancer naturally? It's like an interview with one dude. Right. So you're right that it's, medicine, I think. And remember, people make decisions about their bodies and their nutrition and their health for many reasons. Your patients aren't making the most logical decision when they make a decision about their health. And so, but what is our role in these scenarios, right? Is to just tell them these are just numbers. And I'll say this to my patient, look, these are just numbers. You get to decide if they're important. The statin decreases your risk of having a heart attack by 50%. If that sounds like a big number, then it's a good idea. If that sounds like a small number, then don't take it. But it's just a number. Where we get in trouble as clinicians is when we start to ascribe meaning, goodness, badness, and morality to that decision. It's not our decision. It's the patient's decision. And if they want to make a value-based decision to avoid something, or if they have a value or a fear of medicine, I think it's our responsibility to try and help them unpack that. But I'm not going to put my fear because my grandpa died in the conventional system on them, because that's not fair, right? That's not actually evidence-based. I love your question, Teresa. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think too, what this all speaks to me, it comes back to wanting a seat at the table, because it all plays well together. Right. I can think about what would I do if I received a cancer diagnosis? My mom had a lot of different things going on. And one of them, she had breast cancer, and she had a full mastectomy, and she went through chemo. And would I do the same? Probably, but I would also do a lot of other things alongside it. Right. And that's where I would love to have a seat at the table to talk about what are strategies from a dietary perspective, from a lifestyle perspective, that we can be doing around this to lessen the negative impacts? Because, downside of chemo is that's big. It's big, right? And so how can we play better together and recognize and respect what each brings to the table, and recognize that this is not a world of, choosing from these completely opposite ends of the spectrum, which is what it feels like. It's like you have to choose a side. It's like politics. It's not like that. It's there's so much goodness in both. And how can we cross that bridge and come to the table and have those conversations together? In fact, what our next Clinicians Corner guest is, I think, doing a really good job of that, is Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, who's doing some phenomenal research in terms of the dietary strategies with oncology treatments. But he's, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but he's working in conventional medicine. Like he's not somebody who's in the fringe, right? He is somebody who is like really pioneering, deeply, deeply research based, and looking at how can these two things play together, and how can we bring more tools to the table. So I think this is such powerful stuff. Let me see. I see a question from Suzanne, and then I'm mindful of time here. She says, thank you for the excellent talk and topic. I wonder if you believe that when we focus so much on the latest research and having it guide our decisions, it puts us in a chasing mindset. Oh, great question. I often worry that constantly chasing research ungrounds us and makes us forget what we've learned and timeless lessons of nutrition, such as bioindividuality. Thanks again. A great session.
It's a great question. And actually, it's funny you mentioned, Margaret, like have you gone back through some previous content and like righted the wrongs in there? So tomorrow, I actually give a lecture for the Confident Clinician that is a research update on cervical dysplasia. It's a topic we did 3 years ago. And even when I pull up my slides from 3 years ago, I'm like, oh, Jordan, these are brutal. But which speaks to how exciting it is to change, right? And I'm like, I can't wait to redo these. One was like very poorly referenced. And like, I'm in evidence, like this is what I do, is I teach evidence. And sometimes there's a slide that's missing a reference. However, to your point there, Suzanne, I think there's a difference between chasing research that is not clinically relevant or clinical versus watching the trends in clinical care. So I'll give you an example. So 3 years ago, when I did this cervical dysplasia lecture, there was one trial on green tea for cervical dysplasia. There was one trial on indole 3-carbinol for cervical dysplasia. And there was one trial, there were no trials on probiotics. 0. But the concept of microbiome was being discussed. That was 3 years ago. Fast forward 3 years later, there is still only one trial on indole 3-carbinol, but there's some mouse data that it inhibits HPV. There's 2 trials now on green tea, both by the same company, unfortunately, but there's some mouse data that suggests that green tea actually might inhibit HPV too. And there's 2 trials on probiotics. And there's one trial on a brand new thing. But like in 3 years, the conversation did not pivot 180. In 3 years, we got a little bit more clarity on what we were doing. Right. So I don't think that staying up to date with the research is chasing new and different, and I'm going to throw my old treatment plans on the garbage and I got to start from scratch because I'm being evidence-based. The research starts to inform the theme of where we're moving. And what we have to acknowledge is that we're never sitting in a position of knowing the truth, and that we're constantly seeking a more truthful answer. Right. And so if a study had come out that said, you know what, Jordan, this green tea actually causes cervical dysplasia, I would take that slide out. Right. And say, well, we shouldn't do that anymore because now the research says we shouldn't do it. But instead, the research has said, well, we understand this mechanism like a hair better than we did in 2021. So I updated the slide. But I agree with you that like if you felt like you had to add every paper that ever came out about green tea to your repertoire, we would be overwhelmed and we would lose track of like that good connection and behavior change and all the things that you do so beautifully. But research is informing our future decision making and helping us move towards a theme. It's very rare that when one paper comes in at us sideways, it completely upsets the boat. but we need to be aware of those studies as they come in so that we can change our mind when it's the right time.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I want to, very similar experience to us when we went back through our materials. I was nervous, of course, thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to add, we're going to find out that we've been doing everything wrong. I mean, I wasn't that nervous because we see the great results people get in changing their health. So, and it wasn't that it was based in no research. It just the citations weren't in the materials, right? So having what ended up happening is really just a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of the mechanisms underneath things that we've seen working in clinical practice. And that felt just so delightfully reassuring. And there are things that we've changed, like the vitamin D that we talked about earlier. That has been that's a big change. We still get pushback from it. I expect to get pushback from it now. We have this fantastic conversation, which I'm going to definitely encourage people to go watch, because I just think it's so important for all of us to be hyper aware that we all come in with that cognitive bias. So, oh my gosh, I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much. I would love you to share, because I'm sure the thought that is going through everybody's mind here is like, oh my God, how do I stay up to date on all of this? And this is one of the key things that you do. So can you share a little bit more about the Confident Clinician and how you support practitioners? And I know your registration just opened and closed, but let's talk a little bit about how you do that.
Yeah, so our goal is mostly that time-saving piece for clinicians, right? And I think there is a bit of an industry expectation that you sit with a patient for an hour and they leave and you go, okay, great. Now the real work begins, and you spend 3 hours curating this beautiful individual plan for them, right? And that's one of our biggest barriers to clinicians being successful, feeling successful, and we say making it home in time for dinner. But truly, so many clinicians wear this martyr hat when they are working with patients because they feel like they can never close the book on their patient charts or stay up to date in a way that helps them feel confident in what they're doing. So when we developed the Confident Clinician, it was really with those pain points in mind. It was like, how would it feel if we just showed you where we're at right now, right? Like, how would it feel if we created some of those handouts for you, right? Based on the evidence. How would it feel if we actually walked you through what this research is saying so that you could communicate it to your patient or their physician or whoever you needed to? What would that feel like, right? Which is where our name, the Confident Clinician, came from, because really that goal for us is to alleviate those major pain points in our industry. Most medical databases are really well represent conventional care. And I don't know if any of you subscribe to any, whether it's Medscape or Up to Date or some of those conventional databases. If you type in glaucoma, they're going to give you all the drugs, all the options, right? And they'll have one bullet. Well, nutrition might help.
Yeah.
And what we've done is we've taken that bullet and said, well, hang on here. We're pretty sure there's research about that. And we've built an entire database that actually reflects where we're at with our research, so that if you go in and you type glaucoma, you get all the things that you would need to support your patient, the dose of the supplements, agnostic, again, no brand recommendations, and all the things that you would need to actually confidently make a decision for your patient. How you say it, when you say it, that's up to you, right? That's where your unique, special experience for people working with you comes from. So we're not ruining, integrative medicine by telling people that they should just give them 25 milligrams of zinc. What we're doing is giving them a springboard to work from, so that they know what they're doing for their patient has efficacy and is going to make change. So that's how we've built it. We do run some live training, but the big value add for people is that searchable database where they can do an at a glance, they can download the content to give to their patients, or they can watch the deep dive videos that we do run live, actually, and then they get stored on the site as for future use. If people want to go back and learn, well, how did she make that decision about green tea? We walk you through the research so that you can feel more confident in the areas that you want to.
I love it. You're doing such important work. Thank you so much.
I'm really proud of it. And I'm proud of our clinicians too. It's neat to watch the clinicians that we've been working with for the last couple of years. Really, they're really changing the way they practice. They're changing the way they lean on the resource, which I think is just beautiful. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about where things are going.
This is wonderful. How do people stay connected with you?
Yeah, I'm a pretty decent Instagrammer. And lots of like really good call outs there. So in the last, speaking of haters, right? I've had some very serious haters over the last 2 weeks. Apparently antibiotics for UTIs is very controversial, which I didn't realize until we posted about it. But that's where you can also get some insight around podcasting. I do have a great women's health podcast called Women's Health Unplugged. And also on that Instagram, you could subscribe to, we do have a free integrative medicine journal for clinicians. So it's clinician focused, it's not patient focused, where we're giving some insights. I do some writing about cognitive distortion and bias, which is quite fun to read, but also gives you like those quick clinical updates that we're seeing in the literature right now that you can just like pack into your practice. So I'm happy to share that link to Margaret if that's helpful.
Yeah, please share that link, and we'll make sure that all of this is included in our replay. And when are you opening up doors for registration again?
In January. Yeah. So we typically open twice per year. And we do that on purpose. We know that, we want to be able to focus on our new members when they join so that they get the most out of their experience with the database. We also like really walk them through how to get oriented around thinking about evidence-based practice and whatnot. So we only do that twice a year. So when we bring in those, 100 new people, that we can really put a lot of focus towards them. Yeah. We also in the membership include 2 deep dive weekends. And so by having our onboarding in July and in January, it helps make sure that everybody gets access to those included live events.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Amazing. I'm super cognizant of time, and I could keep you here all night because I love chatting with you and there's so many fun things that we can talk about. Thank you so much. I think this is one of the most important conversations we've had on this. Honestly, I really hope everybody takes time to watch and rewatch it. I think it's the future of our field. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And definitely like follow along. The Confident Clinician Club has its own Instagram as well. It's a great place to kind of get connected with this idea, right? Because this is a process to learn too.
Is it the Confident Clinician Club? Is that the
Confident Clinician Club? Yep, you got it. Yeah, this is a process, right? And it can be so uncomfortable. But think about when your patients are healing and how they're like, this is hard, right? Like we should be doing the same thing with our clinical practice, is having those like hard moments, but then we get to like experience the joy and beauty on the other side of those hard moments. And so the Confident Clinician is this really safe container where you get to try on change, actually. And that's what a lot of our fellowship participants say. They're like, yeah, we get to like think differently, and that's embraced, right? And it's not risky to do it in this community.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much.